All right, so as I said, I'm just going to recap a little bit the first 4 slides from last week. These won't be in the slides I upload tonight, but just so you're all reminded, this is our staff for the class, and you can go to the next one. The website for the class is really important, so we want you to use this quite a bit. The study guides are up there. The first assignment that you'll download, the take-home assignment on cognitive mapping, is there. And there's a lot of interesting links up there. And very important, when you have a question about anything in the class, go to this Gmail address. It's called environmentalpsych@gmail.com. And we're monitoring that every day. We'll get back to you quickly. And that's the best way to get a fast response. And we'll be sending out class announcements to the listserv that way as well. And you've got your link to course readings up there and to the lecture slides that I post after class. Okay. This is what the web files folder of readings looks like. Hopefully all of you are getting to those okay and downloading the readings without any problem. And then finally, our paperback texts. If you want to buy them, they're at the bookstore, or they're on Library Reserve, or also at the Planning, Policy, and Design Department office if you want to check them out there. Okay?
At Langston Library.
Langston Library, if you want to get them there. Okay. So, last time I was talking about how the field of environmental psychology is situated within our School of Social Ecology. And there are a number of common assumptions that all of our fields within the school share, whether you're in criminology, planning, psychology, what have you. And the broad mission of the School of Social Ecology, if you ever go on a job interview or you're applying to grad school and they ask you what is social ecology, you can say it's a school that aims to train students to analyze research and policy questions from a broad ecological perspective, integrating multiple disciplines, and linking theory and research with community problem solving. So those are shared by all of our different fields within the School of Social Ecology. And the way we're structured with our 3 departments is that we often encourage students to look for the overlaps or the interface between our different departments. So if you look in this middle dark area here, you might have a question like, if I design a dysfunctional environment, like a school under an airport runway or an apartment building over an expressway, what kind of factors, what kind of influence is that going to have on people's behavior, their learning in classrooms, what kind of effect is it going to have on their blood pressure, their health up here, and finally, what kind of opportunities does it create for crime? Because a lot of our physical environments actually are conducive to more victimization and crime than environments we would call defensible space environments. So we're going to talk about defensible space a little bit later, but you can see how the different departments or areas of our school come together that way. Today I'll be talking about the Rashad and Grossman article on obesity. We'll talk about obesity as a social community problem that has a lot of environmental psychological aspects to it. And when we talk about looking at health problems from a broad social ecological perspective, we're immediately assuming we're coming at it from different disciplinary perspectives. We're bringing a multi-level approach. So a developmental psychologist might look at a child's development within a home environment and the parents, but an ecological developmental psychologist would look at, okay, how does the school influences impinge on the home environment? Or how does political turmoil or environmental racism in the community affect that child's development in the home? So it's multi-level, and what you have is the child embedded in many contextual layers. So we're looking at how those different contexts jointly affect what we're studying, whether it's crime, development, any other phenomenon. We talk about systems theory, and I'll go into that more next week. And basically, it's looking at how people or organisms and environments come into equilibrium. So when you move into a dormitory, you want to feel that there's a good fit between your needs and what that dormitory has to offer. You want to reach a harmony or equilibrium. And sometimes we have systems that go into what we call deviation amplification. That would be things like the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, the digital divide that keeps growing. So people on the wrong side of the digital divide get more and more disadvantaged. That's called deviation amplification. So not all systems go to equilibrium. And that's important to remember. But we'll be talking about feedback loops and how these different system elements are interdependent. And what happens when we go in to do a community intervention and we really mess things up because we thought we had a good theory, but we cause all kinds of unintended side effects. And sometimes you need a systems approach to anticipate that. If you don't have a broad conceptual model, you may miss those potential unintended side effects. So we'll talk about how that happens with several examples this quarter. And finally, that application to community problem solving, public policy, we call that an action research perspective. We're doing research in the service of action, getting some things improved in society, translating theory and research findings into community interventions. Okay, so everybody clear on that? Okay. Now we'll be talking about the ecology of obesity. How can this be viewed from an ecological perspective, and what's the environmental psychology involved in this topic? Before we do that, we're going to show you some animated maps of how obesity has become a crisis in this country in the last several years. And some of you may have looked at these maps on the syllabus page, the week 1 page, but it puts the problem in graphic relief. So, yeah, you can put, okay. Yeah. How many of you have had a chance to look at those? Any of you? Okay. So we're going to talk about some of the implications of what you see in those slides. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, we can go through them. No, just hit play, I think, at the top. That'll run them. Okay, here we go. So 1998, 99. And what you see is as the colors of the states change, we're going up in obesity. So as we go from no data or light blue, less than 10% of the population in the state is obese, what you're seeing now with that first blue state, you've got 15 to 19% obesity. And then by 2010, you've got all these red states that are over 30% obesity. And it turns out in the United States today, 36% of our population as a whole are obese. Okay, that's a pretty high percentage, over 30% of our population. And what you see here is interesting too, that in the southeast you have a kind of cluster of states there where there are a lot of health problems that come together, not just obesity. They have higher cervical cancer rates in those states. They have higher smoking cancer rates. A lot of those states grow tobacco and sell tobacco. So it's interesting when you look at an environmental ecological perspective, you start to see how these health problems are actually distributed geographically. And if you do geographic information systems analysis, you can start to layer over those states and see, well, what factors might be accounting for that cluster of problems. So there's a lot of interesting implications of those slides as you look at them. Now, let's go back to the ecology of obesity slide. If you have had a chance to read the Rashad and Grossman article in the first week, the first class session, that's taking a very broad ecological approach to obesity, because what it's saying is that there are many different factors that contribute to the obesity of an individual or population. Anybody recall some of those factors that come together to predict obesity? Yeah. Pardon me? Okay, women going into the workforce. Interestingly enough, that accounts for a large increase in children's obesity, because the food that kids are eating on the fly while their parents are working isn't necessarily as nutritious as what they're getting when both parents or one parent is home. Other factors that come up in that article, yeah? Advances in technology, so what kinds of things? Like allowing a microwave that allows for packaged food. Good. What's your name? Amanda. I'm going to keep asking you guys names so we start to learn names. What's your name? David. Okay, Dave. Thank you. So there are a lot of things. What we know from that article is between 1960 to 1980, the obesity rate of the U.S. population was about 14%. And then from 1980 to 2000, it jumped to about 30%. So there was a lot of research looking at why did it jump? And what accounts for 2/3 of the increase in the U.S. obesity rate between 1980 and 2000? Anybody remember? 2/3 of that increase in obesity in our country. Yes? Okay, a lot of those factors are working together, but there's one that stands out. What's your name? Anita. One that stands out really prominently. It's people relying more and more on fast food and even full-service restaurants. So America started to go out for dinner and go out for food outside the home a lot more frequently from 1980 on, and that accounts for a big jump in the obesity rate. So what that's saying is there's something going on between smoking and overeating, and maybe people are compensating when they're not smoking and they want to eat more, raise their mood. So there are a lot of interesting factors there. How do you design public policies that get people not to smoke but also help to prevent obesity, so that you don't have policies that are exaggerating one problem while solving another? So that article presents a very sort of broad, multi-level kind of ecological perspective on a social problem. Certainly the price of food during the time that the obesity went up from 1980 to 2000, the price of food dropped and the supply of food was much more plentiful. So you had restaurants sort of supersizing you in movie theaters, and we're going to see a few slides about that. So there we have, well, the Monster Thick Burger has 1,420 calories. You can see the Carl's Jr. double $6 burger has 1,420. It's way more than anybody would need to eat in a particular meal, and the stuff that goes into that sandwich is not necessarily the most nutritious for you. So, you know, restaurants are putting out big sizes, not the best food, but it's plentiful, it fills people up, they like it, it's comfort food. And this guy, Morgan Spurlock, did a documentary called Super Size Me. How many of you have seen Super Size Me? Oh, a lot of you, okay. So you know that for a whole month, he went on a McDonald's diet for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the guy almost, well, I don't know if he almost died, but he got pretty sick. His liver enzymes got messed up. His girlfriend was pleading with him, please go off this diet, you're going to kill yourself. No, I must go on, I am doing this documentary. But basically, what he showed is that if you stay on that type of diet for a month, you do real damage to a lot of your body systems. So this is a little promotion for his movie. And over the course of his experiment for a month, he got checked out pretty routinely by physicians, and they monitored his blood pressure and a lot of other basic, you know, physiological indices. And he was going downhill pretty fast. When he first started this, he was quite nauseous. He really couldn't eat all that fast food. And then as he went further, he kind of got used to it, but his body started to show all the effects. It was just the McDonald's diet, but he was getting more and more stressed because in addition to how he felt, his girlfriend was, you know, saying, get off this diet. So they had a little thing going on. He didn't feel up to it. As I remember the movie, he was fatigued. He just, you know, showed a lot of the signs. So it's kind of an interesting example of what happens when you consume that much food. Now, some of you mentioned the technological changes. When we have microwaves, we don't have to linger over the oven and, you know, cook a good meal. We can toss something in and get it done quickly and eat it fast on the fly. And that's not necessarily the best food for us in a lot of cases. Yeah, another thing is that with the rise of the computer age, we've become more sedentary. So we had TVs before for sure, but now we're doing so much of our work on the computer, whether it's email or texting or writing papers. And so this has created a more sedentary lifestyle. So these are some of the technological changes that have created those health consequences we've been talking about. Sitting on the 405 freeway or some other congested route, in sprawling cities like Los Angeles, where you have jobs and housing spread way out from each other, the obesity rates in those populations are higher. And the urban geographers attribute those differences in sprawl, non-sprawl cities to the fact that people are more sedentary in their cars commuting. They spend a lot more time commuting than people in a more rural or less sprawling neighborhood. And this is an example. Frumkin, Frank, and Jackson did a book on the effects of urban environments on health. And what they found is, these are the researchers that found that data about the linkage between rates of sprawl in different cities and the obesity of the population. You want to go back just a minute? What are the things that cause sprawl? Well, one thing is land use patterns. So if you have a separation, people in urban studies will know, if you have jobs housing imbalance, where you have most of your housing in one part of the community and then people have to commute long distances to get to their jobs, it's not an integrated community, that creates sprawl. Another factor that creates sprawl is transportation configuration. So if you have streets that aren't connected well and people can't walk easily, they have to take a freeway to get from point A to B because there aren't a lot of surface streets that connect conveniently. So that street connectivity is another factor that contributes to sprawl. So summarizing over the Rashad and Grossman article, these are the factors that they identified as jointly contributing to the rise in obesity in the US between 1980 and 2000. But as we know, the problem isn't over because we went from 30% obesity in 2000 to about 36% now. So it's continuing to be a major problem. But everything from the supply and price of food, the growth of the restaurant and fast food industry, new technologies like microwaves, urban sprawl, less physical activity, greater taxes on cigarettes and other tobacco products, which are very effective in getting people not to smoke, but they have these odd consequences for obesity. And then even participation of women in the labor force. No one would say that it's bad for women, well maybe some would, but a lot of people would say it's good that there are more women participating in the labor force. There's greater parity between the genders in the labor force, but we have to somehow come to grips with what that might be correlated with in terms of some of these health issues, and how do we tone down the health issues while maintaining that parity in the workplace. And that gets into the realm of public policy. Now, environmental psychology comes into the picture in terms of different environments that invite people to be active. So these are some slides from Irvine, and we saw that little parody about living in Irvine, the bubble. But this is Woodbridge, a community residential area in Irvine where you've got the human-made lake and you've got the nice mountains when you can see them through the smog or without the smog. This is another neighborhood in Irvine called University Park, which provides extensive green belts. And when we get to the second half of the course, when we talk about planning strategies for enhancing environments, you'll see that some of these strategies come out of English urban planning in the 1800s and early 1900s. Ebenezer Howard wrote a book called The Garden City. And according to Ebenezer Howard, the greatest good in a community was to expose people to nature. He wanted to get people out of the crowded areas of London and pull them into these rural areas in England, or areas that had no more than about 45,000 residents, because those would be high quality, safe, nurturing environments. So you see that carried over in planned communities in the US. A lot of the planners of the Irvine Company, for example, took those Garden City ideas and put them right into Irvine, along with Kevin Lynch's ideas about urban imageability, how do you create cities that have a strong identity and that type of thing. Although some would say, well, it didn't work in Irvine, it's sort of nondescript, but we'll talk more about Kevin Lynch, and that's the first exercise that you'll do on his notion of cognitive mapping. Yeah?
Was it Pomona that was sort of modeled after that book?
There are a number of cities that have been modeled after Kevin Lynch's book, Image of the City, and I would say that Irvine is one of them, because the first president of the Irvine Company, Ray Watson, got his degree at Berkeley in urban and regional planning, read Kevin Lynch, came to Irvine, and hired urban designers to implement his principles. So we'll see some examples of that as we go. The notion of walkability means, how likely or easy is it for someone to be a pedestrian in a city? And so here in Irvine, one of the things the community has done, they put in this median strip with a lot of planting to slow down the traffic near this schoolyard here. And they've put a lot of trees along the sidewalk. So people like to be outdoors. They like to be walking in that type of environment. When you have these monolithic, how many of you have been near the Bonaventure Hotel downtown LA? That's a kind of monolithic concrete environment that looks good from the sky, and it relates well to the freeways, but if you're a pedestrian around there, it's really tough. It's not the most inviting place to walk. So that would be an example of hard architecture, at least the outside of that hotel. But these are some of the things you can do to make an environment more walkable. Now, related to the Rashad and Grossman article, we talk about this study done by Christakis and Fowler, who are network theorists, network scientists. And what they did is they took over 12,000 people in the Framingham Heart study, and they studied them from 1971 to 2003, so about 30 years there, over 30 years. And they looked at what happened in their networks where somebody was in a network and their friend became heavier. And what they found is over time, the friend of the friend became heavier. And 50% greater chance to become overweight if your friend got heavier in a particular period of time. 37% greater chance if, if your spouse got heavier. Friends were the most influential, even more influential than siblings or more influential than spouses. Yeah?
So is this idea kind of like a regression of the mean, where...
No, it's not regression to the mean that they're talking. What they're calling it is a kind of contagion factor where people model what their friends are like. So if a friend comes into your network and they start getting heavier, it's more likely that friends in that network will also get heavier, which is kind of interesting to think because we've been talking about physical environmental influences on obesity, like those nice green belts in Irvine and things like that. What they're saying is that social networks can be an engine for greater obesity or less obesity. They can also influence the spread of happiness. So if you join a network and one of your friends gets more depressed, you're more likely to follow that mood. That's one of the things they found in their book. They also have some really interesting examples from Facebook influence, how friends on Facebook affect each other's preferences for music, for movies, and we'll show some slides of that. What's your name?
Amber.
Amber, thank you, Amber. Question. So the question is, why didn't they plan a downtown in Irvine? And we're going to talk later in the course about pro-density and anti-density designers. People like Thomas Jefferson, who wanted to live on a mountaintop in Monticello, Virginia, hated density. The worst thing for him was living in a crowded city. And yet, other planners and designers like Le Corbusier in France, designing cities for millions of people, they felt that density was where culture happens, that's where you get people together. But in Irvine, there was more influence on trying to avoid these downtown conglomerates. And so you have this sort of spread out feel. And some would say a little bit of a sprawl. But that's one of the things that went into the reasoning. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying Irvine is super walkable. I think you have to, like if you want to get from campus down to Woodbridge, you probably have to jump on a bus or, there are bike lanes, but it's very spread out, from the southern side to the northern side to get to Northwood. So yeah, the dimensions are not easily walkable. It's definitely not walkable. Okay. So Mark's going to run an animation of this network just to show you kind of what happened as people were in this network, experienced, friends of theirs getting heavier. Also, there are the color of the lines between the different people in the network show their relationships. So the red lines are friends, and then you've got a relationship with family members. Yeah, if you go to that, yeah, that's it.
Is a dynamic graphic representation of a portion of the Framingham Heart Study social network. Each circle or node represents one person in the data set. Nodes with red borders are women, and nodes with blue borders are men. The size proportional to each person's body mass index, or BMI, which is the weight in kilograms divided by the square of the height in meters. A yellow node represents an obese person with a BMI greater than 30, and a green node represents a non-obese person. A line between two nodes represents social connection between two people. Purple lines connecting nodes denote close genetic ties, for example, parents, children, and siblings. Gray lines denote non-genetic relations, such as friends and spouses. Obesity is a multicentric epidemic, with many people influencing one another and forming ties in complex ways. The network gets more compact and dense as more ties appear. And the entire network gets heavier over time. Quantitative analyses demonstrate a tendency for obese people and non-obese people to form clusters within the network, so that by the end of the study, this clustering can be discerned, as in the densely interconnected clusters of obese persons here, and the non-obese persons here. The prevalence of obesity appears lower at the periphery of the network as compared with the center.
So remember, this is happening between 1971 to 2003. And these sketches that we showed you are what we call multiplex networks, which is to say there are many different sub-networks represented. So you've got friendship networks, you've got spousal networks, you've got sexual partner networks, you've got other, second and third cousin networks all lumped together. And when you disaggregate those, you see the same kind of patterns where people are influencing themselves in either a heavier or lighter weight direction. But it's especially prominent for friendship networks. Somehow our peers, our friends, have the greatest influence on that weight factor.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. Is it self-selection where people are looking for other heavy people so they don't stand out as much or they feel, sort of validated? And they control for that. And what they found is even controlling for self-selection, it was the influence over time in a causal way that accounted for that increase in weight. So. Yeah, interesting, good question. And I'm sorry, your name again? Amanda. It's going to take me a little while, so I'll say, what's your name? Okay. Okay, next. Now, so this is a book that Christakis and Fowler did in 2009, Connected. And they were very interested in looking at how social networks affect health. And so just some basic terminology. A social network consists of all the connections and ties within a group or collection of groups. And a group is a collection of individuals defined by a common attribute. Okay? So these are each of these little circles are individuals and they're tied together. In some cases, individuals will be out on the periphery, not necessarily linked to others, but that's what they mean by a social network. And so a node in that network is one person. And embeddedness of the person is the degree to which they're connected within a network. So this is a more embedded central person. They're connected to a lot of others. This would be a less embedded peripheral person in that network. What's happened for our country as a whole is that our social network in the US has gotten heavier from 30% in 2000 to 36% now. And these lines represent links or relationships between two people. The simplest network is a dyad, or a pair of people, and they get together to form larger interconnected webs of relationships. Now we're going to talk about some of their research on Facebook users. So the average Facebook user has about 110 friends, and I'm sure many of you have maybe thousands, but nonetheless, the average is about 110. Of those, approximately 6.6 are close friends. In the Facebook, we'll talk about what they mean by close friends. In the Facebook study of online social networks, Christakis and Fowler used the tagged photos, people that you tag others in pictures, as a definition of who's a close friend, because they, in a sense, they have real-world connections. They were in a picture together, so they must be, that's the sort of determinant or criterion they used, okay? So these online social networks are reflecting both your real-world offline interactions as well as these new virtual connections. Now, what they found is that when they looked at how, just like they did the Framingham Heart study, where they were looking at how people influence each other getting heavier or lighter, if somebody in your network gets lighter, you tend to get lighter, not heavier. But they said, okay, what about how people influence each other on Facebook? So if you put up that you like the Beatles, or you like the group called the Killers, is somebody else going to pick up on that and then like it themselves? And what did they find? What do you think they found for all Facebook friends, whether they were close friends or not close friends? Do you think they found these relationships? What did they find? If you were looking for influence among different people in the social network on their friends' tastes in music, books, movies, do you think they found it for everybody in their friendship networks on Facebook? Or a subset of those friends? What do you think? Who influenced whom the most? Okay. Yeah, the people who are the tagged photo friends, that you tag yourself or them in photos, among those people, there were profound sort of over time influences. So if one friend in that network says they like a particular musical group, then their friends, their close friends, follow suit, just like we saw in the obesity network. And the Beatles are a pretty popular group, so they're more diffusely liked by a lot of people in that network, whereas the killers are more kind of acquired taste, so they're more of a, they call them a tight cluster of music fans for that group. Okay. Now, that's kind of an interesting example of what happens on Facebook in terms of social network influence. Another thing that happens on Facebook, and as you know, we're interested in this class not just in place-based environments like this classroom, but virtual environments, which might be a distance education chat room, for example. So we're starting to layer our virtual environments on top of our place-based real environments. But one of the questions that comes up is, when people put up their profiles, are they trying to sort of misrepresent themselves as ideal? So do you put up a picture or a description of your interests that makes you look better, more ideal? Or do you kind of sort of play out your regular personality in real life on your Facebook page? And this group, it's an article assigned for today, did a study where they had people first rate their own personalities on a set of standard personality scales. There were about 236 subjects in the US and in Germany. And then they had observers for the US individuals. They had observers rate their personalities, both in terms of their actual personality and whether they were trying to idealize themselves. And the individuals who put up the profiles also rated what they would like ideally to be like. So you could compare their sort of actual ratings, I'm like this actually, versus I would really like to be that way. And they had these two hypotheses. The idealized virtual identity hypothesis says that profile owners display idealized characteristics that do not reflect their actual personalities. So there's a lot of sort of fibbing and misrepresentation going on. And that's like you see these dating sites saying, you know, you don't know what you're getting because people are putting up pictures that are just awesome. And then when you meet people, offline, they're not as awesome as the photos. And then this other hypothesis says extended real life, people use online social networks to communicate their real personality. And what did they find in that study? When you look at those personality scales, there are certain attributes that are easier for observers to pick up on. Like you look at somebody's page, or you go into their dorm room, you can tell if they're extroverted, they're outgoing, or you might be able to tell if they're more introverted, less outgoing. You can tell if they're neat, obsessively neat, or anything goes and everything's cluttered all over. But to pick up on things like neuroticism, is somebody neurotic or are they a little off? That's pretty hard to pick up on. So some of the Big 5 and Big 10 personality factors on those scales were easier for people to agree on. But across all of them, the greater support when you control for idealized Facebook images or Facebook aspirations, where people want to be ideal in some way. You control for those ideal representations or reports on a personality scale, you see that their Facebook pages actually show more how others perceive them to be actually and how they perceive themselves to be actually. So an interesting study there in terms of how people are using these social networks. That's one of the reasons, of course, that employers want to get your password to Facebook so they can really do some ethnographic studies of prospective employees, and there's a lot of battle going on right now as to whether employees should really be able to get those passwords, because they take them as pretty good representations of what people are like. Now, another factor that I want to talk about in terms of network theory is something called scale-free networks versus random networks. A random network is where you have the nodes distributed kind of evenly. So if you were looking at the nodes in a network and how many links are in each node, the typical node would have a lot of links, but then on the outside edges, they'd have fewer. Whereas in a power law kind of distribution, and this would be like if the airports in the US were evenly distributed randomly. This is like the hub system. So you've got Chicago, you've got Dallas, LA, Seattle. That's a scale-free network in the sense that these networks continue to add more and more flights and more connections, so they get to be mega hubs, and they're particularly influential, much more so if you have a random distribution of equally influential hubs. So this is called a power law distribution of node links. The number of nodes in a network, very few of them are these hubs over here that have a huge number of links. Okay, so that's what this is saying, whereas here, each node would have about the same number of links, and they would be distributed normally in that curve. So the internet is a pretty good example. When you have web portals like Google and Facebook, they are mega nodes. Okay, they're scale-free networks. They continue to get more and more connected. There's no limit to them, and in that sense, they're scale-free. Another area where you can see these tendencies in network growth and hub growth is in science and research, where there's been a kind of evolution toward team science and large research networks. So in the days of the single creative genius, you know, like Darwin or Einstein or Beethoven, you had folks kind of working on their own. A few influential thinkers, Galileo, Newton, Darwin, Einstein. And what's happened over time is there's been this growth toward network science to where now we talk about team science, interdisciplinary team science, where people are being coaxed into interdisciplinary teams because knowledge is getting so specialized that people, if you're a psychologist, you don't know enough about neuroscience or about sociology to work on your own. You've got to partner with these other people to fill in those gaps. So nowadays, we have, you know, the Watson and Crick collaboration. That was kind of on the way toward large research networks where you had a dyad. Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. But nowadays, we have these mega research centers where people are reinforced to work in a very large network. Yeah. So when you're trying to address huge issues like the structure of DNA or getting to the moon or atomic energy or space flight, there's no way that you can get there without a kind of team approach, a networked approach. So there's a lot of interest these days in network science. And many of these research agencies and foundations are pouring money into setting up transdisciplinary research centers. So when we say the School of Social Ecology puts a big premium on interdisciplinarity, one of the things that's good for you coming out of a School of Social Ecology and getting some of that exposure is that you'll have some appreciation of what that means, because more and more fields, more and more businesses are requiring team collaboration. So National Institute of Health, MacArthur Foundation, which is a private research foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, National Academy of Sciences, Keck Foundation, they're all putting huge amounts of money into creating scientific teams. Sometimes they work well and sometimes they don't work so well. People get together and it's like a Tower of Babel. They can't understand each other, they don't like each other because they have different worldviews. It doesn't always work, but this is the trend. When we started the School of Social Ecology, the program in social ecology in the 70s, a lot of the administrators on this campus thought it was a dumb idea because it would be broad, but it wouldn't be deep. You'd have a lot of people speaking different languages and they couldn't really connect. Nowadays, research centers and departments and schools are falling over each other trying to show how interdisciplinary they are. So it's become more of a bandwagon effect, you know, motherhood and apple pie type of thing. But it doesn't always work, and we'll talk about some of the ways it doesn't. This is an example of a tobacco science network where people were encouraged to form these tobacco use prevention centers. And you can see how the networks evolved across those 7 centers here, whereas these are individual NIH grants where you have much smaller networks. The nodes aren't as connected to as many people. And some would say, well, this is better. You know, the more networking you get going on, the better. It doesn't necessarily mean that these links and these nodes are doing anything productive. They're just, you know, connected in some way. They might have a telephone conversation. They might publish a paper together. But the data are still out as to whether this kind of networking pattern in science is not as good as this or vice versa. This is another National Institute of Health Center for Population Health and Health Disparities, and they started out with these different university-based centers, Ohio State, Tufts, University of Pennsylvania, and they're different colors. And this is what they look like at the beginning of the first year of that initiative. And then as they worked together, they got a lot more interconnected. And so when they went to apply for refunding, they said, look, we're really networked. We did our job. It's great. But as I said, a lot more research has to go on now to sort of calibrate, you know, what's the value of the science coming out of a network like this versus one where people are working more individually. Some would say that you get less groupthink when you give more grants to fewer people because they come at it from a lot of different angles and they don't start developing this conformity of thought. Now this is an interesting study published in Nature, which is a very prestigious journal. It's called the Swedish Sex Web Study. And basically, they were looking at whether there's a power law distribution of sexual nodes in the population in Sweden. So they had 4,781 Swedes aged 18 to 74, 59% response rate. And here you have the number of linkages, sexual partners, where over here on the edge you've got some power nodes, 10 to the 3 partners. Here you've got 10 to the 1, 10 partners. Here you've got 10 to 100. And what they find is this power law distribution, where most people are not off on this edge of the network here, totally promiscuous. But why is this important? Is this just kind of a strange thing that some researchers decided to do and they got it published? Why is it? What are the implications of this? Does it have any real world value? Is it just some jaded study that was done? What do you think? How would you apply these results? Yeah. Okay, so for public health research, good. What's your name? Susan, right. Okay, so Susan's saying if you're a public health researcher and you're trying to decide how can we prevent STDs, well, maybe rather than doing scattershot, shotgun approach, giving information out to everybody in the population or preventive measures to everybody, maybe you try to identify through networking studies, to the extent that people will tell you these things about their lifestyles. If you can identify the people that are extremely active sexually, they are likely to be the hubs for spreading STDs. So if you can get to them and sort of lower their profile in terms of infection rates and things like that, then it's a much more effective, more targeted, more cost-effective public health strategy. So, but again, it picks up on that idea that you've got a scale-free network. You've got some people that have, it seems like limitless contacts with others, and then you've got people that are more in the usual range. And they're saying, this is your target of opportunity over here. If you can identify those people in terms of prevention, that's where you want to go. Okay, let's go back. So Mark's going to play kind of an interesting interview here by Stephen Colbert. I think you'll get a kick out of it. Of one of the authors of this book, Connected, James Fowler. So we'll just play this and then we'll take a break. Okay, so that's a pretty good translation of what I was trying to say earlier. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and prelude to next week, where we're going to be talking more about principles of environmental psychology. And there are a couple of articles assigned, one by Barron and Baum and others on environmental psychology and what it is, why we're studying it, things like that. And then there's another article that I wrote some years ago, actually, but it offers a conceptual framework for organizing what we're covering in this class in terms of different types of environment behavior research. So I want to go over that basic framework today, so you'll have that as sort of a cognitive map going forward. So first of all, in terms of some basic principles of what is environmental psychology, we know that it includes different types of environments. We've got built environments, natural environments, human designed, completely natural. We've got virtual and cyber-based as well as place-based, and we've got to look at how those interrelate now. We never had to do that in the 70s and 80s, but now we do. We're talking about what we call transactional relationships, which is a kind of give and take, two-way relationship. The environment influences you, you work back and try to influence the environment. So it's a reciprocal kind of thing that goes on in cycles. And there are these psychological and behavioral processes that we'll focus on as sort of inherent in these transactional relations between people and their surroundings. Environmental psychology is inherently interdisciplinary. We talked already about how we're going to bring in geography, architecture, urban planning, developmental psychology, natural resources management, a lot of different areas, public policy, to be able to both capture the research that's done in environmental psychology as well as its community problem-solving orientation. So we want to look at, well, if we have principles of how to design defensible space, how do we do that in an apartment building? Or how do we make the city of Irvine more imageable or easier to find your way around? So we want to sort of apply those principles in actual environments. And the second half of this course, after the midterm exam, really focuses in earnest on translating what we're covering the first half of the course into these real world kind of environments, whether it's schools, offices, healthcare settings, and the like. Now, when I talk about transactional relationships, these are some sort of curly Q figures here that basically what they're saying is this is an optimal situation where you're not living in a dysfunctional environment. You're living in an environment that lets you kind of work back on it and change it. So you move into a dorm and your roommates are pretty easy to get along with, and you all kind of work out ways to share the room, share the space. So you come in and the environment affects you, and then you start to do things to the environment. You put up some pictures, or you come up with some norms that then affect your future behavior in terms of how to share the space. And it's an ongoing cycle of optimization processes where you're trying to increase that fit or harmony between yourself and your surroundings. Now, if you're living in a hard architecture or dysfunctional environment place, or a poverty-stricken neighborhood, then what you've got is an environment, a rigid environment at time one, basically dictating your behavior at time one. You try to work back and change it, but you can't. You're blocked. And then at time two, it's dictating your behavior, and at time three, and every time you try to work back and change it, you're blocked, either because you don't have financial resources, or because you're a kid living in a building that has so much noise and pollution. You know, we talk about health promotion, getting kids to go outside and exercise, but if they're constantly breathing this stuff by their building because they're right next to a freeway, the cards are pretty stacked against them, right? So these barriers, these blocks, prevent this kind of reciprocal transactional give and take. And so what we're striving for in environmental design and applying these principles to actual real-world environments is to increase optimization. And optimization is a very high bar. You can't always have your optimal, exactly what you want in an environment, but it's a kind of aspiration. It's an asymptote that we strive toward to make it continually better. Often we have to satisfy, so we have to put up with, the best we can get in an environment rather than optimal. But here, you can't even do that. You can't even work toward a more satisfactory situation because the environment's so rigid, it just doesn't let you do that. So everybody clear on these two processes? Any questions about that? Okay, good. All right, so last time I talked about dysfunctional environments, and I gave you some examples of the Los Angeles school that's located under the LAX flight path where the kids are listening to 350 overflights a day over their school. I also showed you the Pruitt-Igoe buildings that were being knocked down because they were dysfunctional. People just wouldn't live there, lots of crime, vandalism, so eventually the whole thing had to be razed and torn down. This is another example in New York City. These are the Washington Bridge apartments built directly over the Trans-Manhattan Expressway in New York. So you can see this very heavily traveled expressway going right under these four buildings. They're four high-rise towers. And some architects thought that was kind of a neat design, put people near their roadways and all of that. But it creates tremendous exposure of the residents here to the noise, to the pollution, and in that respect, it's dysfunctional in terms of their health outcomes. And in terms of their behavior, it's very hard to get out there and get to a walkable environment because you're surrounded by freeways. And so sometimes we don't really think about how the environments we grow up in and where we're living affect our development, affect our well-being, our mood, but they have a profound impact on us. Even the ambient environment, like looking out a hospital window at a park and trees versus looking out at the wall of another hospital building, makes a big difference, according to that study we talked about last time, in terms of rate of recovery, how much pain medication people take. So this issue of functional and dysfunctional environments and environments that allow you to optimize versus grind you into the ground because they won't let you do anything to them. How many of you have ever been in a hard environment that doesn't let you kind of work back on it or improve it? Any examples of that in terms of, anyone want to volunteer an example? Like what's a really dysfunctional hard architecture place or something that, really had a big impact on you because it was so constraining? Mike?
Yeah, Charles. You can use office cubicles as well if you decorate those, but
they're still pretty tight. Yeah. The open plan office movement created a sea of cubicles for the American workforce. They were actually imported from a company in Germany that came up with this open space idea. And people started to really dislike it because there was so much distraction, there was so much anonymity, you couldn't really get a sense of personal identity in them. So Now we have much less emphasis on just open plan and much more on sort of combi environments where you have private spaces where people can work, team spaces, meditation spaces, recreational, daycare. You've got a much more multifunctional kind of workplace. Yeah, did I? Yeah, well, sometimes people complain that Irvine is so uniform, it all looks the same, that it's kind of a hard environment because it's hard for wayfinding. You don't get a sense of individual identity. You go to a place like Laguna Beach and people are sort of, you know, they have different lifestyles, very diverse. So, you know, some environments can be so uniform that people find those constraining. And a lot depends on fit. You know, if you're upper middle class, affluent family that wants to raise kids in a very safe environment, great schools, maybe Irvine's the ticket. But if you're someone looking for more diverse recreational opportunities, nighttime activities, music open all night, you're not going to find it in Irvine.
Structure of it.
Yeah. Well, church design tends to be very monumental because it's an edifice in the glory of God, so you're building very tall structures, you're building church environments where people, they're not sociopital. People aren't supposed to talk a lot in church. They're sociofugal. You just look ahead at what the preacher or minister is saying. And so there's a lot of reasons why you get that kind of hardness to church environments or even library environments. Although not all libraries are like that. If you go to Huntington Beach Library, which is built like a park, it has all glass windows and it's got water elements brought into the interior. It's a very sort of park-like library. A couple of other slides and I'll close. Okay, I talked about this framework laid out in the chapter that I wrote, which is a pretty good roadmap of the different areas we're going to be talking about in this class. And what this says, we call them modes or styles of human environment transaction. And when you're active and you're active cognitively, you're trying to interpret your environment. So you get to Irvine, UCI, you're trying to make sense out of where's everything located, do you like it? Does it fit your personality or not? So you're trying to interpret, is there a good fit here? So when we talk about cognitive mapping research on April 17th, we're starting with the interpretive mode of how people relate to their environments. Then we come down here to the evaluative mode. That's reactive. We're reacting to something. We develop an attitude about it. Or we assess an environment, like a classroom, whether it's good or bad, in what ways. And we assess people's attitudes toward a whole range of different kinds of environments. That we call the evaluative mode because people are reacting, but they're doing it cognitively or emotionally. Over here, active behavioral is where you're operating on the environment in some way. So if somebody crowds you in an elevator and you feel uncomfortable, a stranger, you might move back to increase your personal space. So you're taking charge of the space to make yourself more comfortable. That's a behavioral operative, an active behavioral thing to do. So we'll talk about human spatial behavior. We'll talk about environmentally relevant behavior, whether people go for solar, whether they use green, fuels and those things like that. And then finally, the responsive mode is reactive and it's behavioral. So you can react to a physical environment by getting sick. You know, if you're exposed to some of those environments with a lot of pollution, you may get certain health problems. You may decide to leave an environment, just drop out or walk out because you don't like it. That's a behavioral response. So we're going to move across these different modes of interpretive, evaluative, operative, and responsive. And each of the areas that we cover has research sort of unpacking how people evaluate their environments, interpret them, operate on them, and respond to them. So an example, this last slide, an example of that would be if you took the interpretive mode for music, and I asked you, what kind of music do you like? You know, you interpret what you like based on your perception and your preferences, or you evaluate it. You know, you hate that group, but you really like this group. Or you operate on the environment by playing music to relax or create a certain mood. So you have a party, you want to put certain kind of music on. If you want to relax or study, you have something else. That's operating on the environment. You take charge and you decide the music. And finally, responsive is where the music affects your behavior, your social interaction, or your physiology. Some music can pump you up, increase your heart rate. Some music can create much more interaction in spaces. And a lot of restaurants use this principle. If they want turnover in a restaurant, a fast food restaurant, they put a lot of fast, active music on, or things that annoy people if they sit there too long. Whereas some of your more expensive restaurants will have very low-key, mellow music going, so it kind of invites people to stay. So those are pretty much some of the key points. If you look at the study guide today, if you look at the study guide for week 1, you should see pretty much all those points covered that are on the study guide in these lectures. I will put up the lecture slides probably this evening, and then we'll come back next Tuesday. So have a great weekend.